Hello, my name is Peter Greer, and I am so grateful to be with all of you to share about a topic that I've been thinking about researching for the last few years. When Chris Horst and Anna Haggard and I were doing some research on a book called Mission Drift, there was a moment in that really stood out. And it was a moment as we were looking at what it looks like to pass the mission from one generation to the next generation in Scripture. And one of the most incredibly bold moments in all of Scripture is when Joshua stands in front of the entire nation and he makes this declaration. He says, "As for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." I love his clarity on mission. I love his boldness. I love the way that he so clearly says, "I'm making a declaration today for me and my household that we will be faithful to the God who is leading us into this new land." But it is a bit sobering to look just one page later in Scripture and to realize that the passion that Joshua had was not passed on to the next generation. It says this, just one page later, the book of Judges began, and it says, "After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They turned their back on the God who had done the most miraculous rescue in all of human history." And Dr. Paul Tripp, he summarizes it by saying this way. He says, "Too often, the passions of one generation become the preferences of the second generation and become irrelevant to the third generation." And I believe no moment is there more risk for mission drift to occur than in that moment of transition from one leadership generation to the next. And the question is, how well are we preparing for this moment? How well are we preparing and training to be ready for this moment? And the statistics say we're not doing a great job. There was one study that we saw that said only 17 of organizations have a documented succession plan. Only 17% have something written down that says, when this day happens, this is the process that we're going to go through. And maybe relatedly, according to Harvard Business Review, 40 to 60% of CEOs fail in their first 18 months on the job. Success seems to be elusive, both from a missional standpoint and a practical standpoint. And I think a huge piece of this is that this is a conversation that we don't have often enough. We don't have in the mirror as we talk about it with ourselves. We don't have it with our colleagues, with our board of directors, and with those around us. As we started our research, Doug and I, we started to look at those individuals that had a successful transition. And as we started to have those conversations and we talked to them and then tried to figure out what's the counterfactual, what are those that did not have a successful transition? And we were so grateful for individuals that shared very candidly, this is what I got wrong in the process. We started this process looking for what are the practices that will allow us to very thoughtfully, clearly go through a good succession planning process. But what we found time and again was it actually wasn't a mistake in the practices as much as it was a mistake in the postures leading up to the conversations around succession planning. And so I want to start by just unpacking some of these postures that I believe are upstream from a successful transition. And what are some of these postures? The first one is we've got to unpack some myths. There are some myths that we might need to address head on that we might believe that will sabotage a successful succession process. And the first is this myth of indispensability. Now, this myth was shattered for me, along with shattering of my ankle, when I was playing in an over 40 men's soccer league. And I was playing with my college friends that we played soccer together in college, and this was the reunion tour. We were back on that field, and in our minds, we were 20 years old, playing at Messiah University, and we were having a great time. The challenge is our mind and our body were not at the same place, and our bodies were no longer 20 years old. And I collided with the goalie, had a multiple compound fracture, and that evening, as I was in the hospital trying to figure out if I needed surgery or not, I told the doctor that I had to be on a plane the next morning because there were the most significant events for Hope's fundraising this coming up week. I was supposed to be in Raleigh and then in California, and the doctor, I'll never forget, just looked at me and he said, no, you're not going anywhere. The events went on that week, and the first event, it was in Raleigh, and a friend of mine that was at the event sent a text immediately after, and he said this. He said, "Peter, I love you. Would have been great to see you." But he said, "You weren't missed at all." Went on to say that was probably the best Hope International event he had ever been to. And for all of us, that moment, whether it is a broken ankle or something else, my belief is that the world is going to continue, and there are other individuals that will step up and not just do a good job. In many ways, they're going to do a better job in those moments. So the myth of indispensability, I think we need to pop that. I like how Charles de Gaulle says this. He says, "The graveyards are full of indispensable men, those at one time, leaders of nations, without whom how could that country?" And yet the graveyards are full of them, and the world keeps on turning. So the one myth we need to untangle is this myth of indispensability. The second myth is the myth of "I'll get around to it." I was an individual named Aaron who shared a little bit about his story, but he had built this thriving youth ministry. They had a dilapidated church, they had redone it, and everything was on the up, and individuals were coming, and it was an exciting time of youth ministry. And yet, Aaron received a call to another church, left very quickly, and watched everything that he had built came down. And he said this in a moment of candor. He said it was irresponsible to focus on where we were going with no thought or plans about what would be left behind. There was remorse in his voice as he shared this, because everything that he had built, there wasn't that last step of saying, how do we pass it on? And that is true not just for Aaron and youth ministry, but a lot of organizations. What does it look like to make sure that we are not leaving and then watching something fall apart? The third myth: no one's going to do this job as well as me. We never would state it quite in those words, but I think a lack of succession planning is this belief that I am the one who needs to do this. I have a specific gifting or calling. I need to be the one that does this. But all of these are myths, and they are simply myths. And whether it is pride or busyness or insecurity at a root, these myths inhibit our ability to engage in a successful conversation and planning about succession. So we've got to untangle some of these myths. Second thing that we need to do is we need to reframe this conversation around succession, not just what is best for me, but what is best for the mission. And the organizations that had long-term impact, they always emphasize the mission over me. Perhaps no example is better than there is a hot springs in Japan, and this is actually a picture of the longest running hotel in the world. Started in 705 AD, and there are now 53 generations of leaders that have come in of the same family, and they, one after another, have passed it on, and they understand their moment in time is tied to a broader story, a bigger story. And if that is true for a hotel in Japan, shouldn't it be even more true for those of us that believe we are part of a story that started at the time of Jesus and continues until he returns? We are part of an amazing mission, and to focus on that, the bigger, the broader, the better mission than just particular our moment in it. So the third one, the question of the moment. How do we know if it's the right time? Because sometimes we can think about this topic of succession and we know it comes too early. There still was something left undone, and some have stayed on too late. And the questions that we ask, I think, can help guide us. But the candid ability to ask some questions that says, is this still the right moment? What kind of an organization are we in this season? What type of a leader do we need now? Is it still me? And is it time for a sabbatical or a COO? Or is it time to go? I put this on my calendar every 3 years. Every 3 years I go through these questions. I want to make sure I do not overstay my season of usefulness in this particular place, even though I care so deeply about the mission. Maybe stated differently, because I care so deeply about the mission, I want to figure out this question of timing. And then the last posture that we need to address is the mirror question. Where is my identity? What do we do when we introduce ourselves? I don't know about you, but almost always my vocation is in the opening sentences. What I do and who I am are deeply connected. I'm trying to fight against that a little bit by changing this, but we are unable to have a healthy conversation around succession if our identity is so tied into the work that we do. I like how Price Harding said this. He said, when the incumbent's primary identity is not or no longer tied to leading the organization, good succession occurs naturally. Good succession occurs naturally when we can say, this job that I do is not who I am. I had a moment of clarity in this when I wrote my resignation letter. It was at a time that I had an unhealthy relationship with my work. And writing this resignation letter, putting it in my drawer, and knowing that one day this will be delivered, it will be given. And in that simple practice of writing my resignation letter, just brought to reality, though that day is going to come, what are the things that are not going to change at that moment? I am still going to be a dearly loved child of the King Almighty. I am still, Lord willing, going to be husband to Laurel and dad to Keith, Lily, Miles, and London. Those things are not going to change when my job does change. So as we think about this topic of succession planning, we got to address these posture questions. Are there any myths that we might believe? Are there ways in which we are not focusing on the mission first? Are there ways that we are giving ourselves time and space to explore the right moment? And then lastly, have we untangled our identity from the work that we do? Love to give just a little bit of time for you to reflect on these. Which one of those resonates with you? Which one of those would you say is a challenge that you face when thinking about this important topic of succession planning?